Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. Check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're out there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. Old Horse, What Is to Be Done is available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. Want to acknowledge our funders here, one moment. We're so excited to have Stephen Kuusisto with us this evening. First, we'll hear from Stephen, then he'll be in conversation with the poet Tony Liuzzi. Tony Liuzzi has written 3 books of poetry, most recently Meditation Archipelago, and edited Passwords Primeval, a collection of interviews with 20 American poets. A chair of the English and Philosophy Department at Monroe Community College, he is also a staff writer for the Brooklyn Rail. Stephen Kuusisto directs the Burton Blatt Institute's Programs in Disability at Syracuse University, where he holds a professorship. He is the author of memoirs Have Dog Will Travel, A Poet's Journey, Planet of the Blind, a New York Times notable book of the year, and Eavesdropping, a memoir of blindness and listening, and the poetry collections Only Bread, Only Light, and Letters to Borges. As the poet Ilya Kaminsky has said, Kuusisto is writing at the height of his powers. Old Horse, What Is to Be Done is a beautiful, unrelenting, moving book. It is a book to live with. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Tony, as well. And to those of you who are willing to spend a little bit of your Thursday evening with us. And I thought I'd read a few poems from the book and try to avoid doing what poets always do, which is to go on and on about what's behind the poem. This first one is called You'll Have to Take My Word. And it has a quote from a Finnish poet, Jarkko Laina, who I knew for many years. He passed away young in his early 60s. But he wrote, "Rebellion simply makes a man old." So that's the epigraph to the poem. You'll have to take my word. I've outgrown sentiment, like the old apples on old trees, spirit quiet, clean with decline. As a boy, I was loud with rebellions, buying birds, for instance, releasing them in parking lots, where the grills of Chevrolets gleamed in heartbreak. It's understatement saying, I'm tired. Leave a message, I'll be in touch. The oldest apples hang far into autumn, glow against bare limbs, as if Aphrodite has passed, preoccupied as she must be. I can read with one eye with big magnification on an iPad, so that's what I'm doing here. I probably look a little spooky. This is a little poem called Blind, I Bought a Horse. Blind, I bought a horse, not to ride, though some would, my wife, for instance. No, I bought him because of his loneliness. Orphic horse, retired from the track, left standing in a stall. Have I mentioned his neck? It's long as Noah's hope for new sun. Il miglior fabbro, I whispered to the greater maker. He's an ex-racehorse. He's got a really long neck. I wrote this at the MacDowell Colony a couple of years ago on one of those days when you just can't think of anything. And then suddenly this came. Late in the day, I opened a book of shadows. And I was not unhappy. No one in my world could be found there, and I was not unhappy. Sylvia Plath, quote, I thought the most beautiful thing in the world must be shadow, end quote. Horace, quote, pulvis et umbra sumus, we are but dust and shadow. Auden, of course, quote, every man carries with him through life a mirror as unique and impossible to get rid of as his shadow. And I was not unhappy. Gilles Deleuze, quote, the shadow escapes from the body like an animal we had been sheltering. I was not unhappy. Shakespeare, quote, some there be that shadows kiss. Such have but a shadow's bliss. I tend to write poetry that spreads out on the page, testing the limits of prose. And it looks really like notebook entries. I learned the technique from a Swedish-Finnish poet named Klaus Anderson. This is called After So Much Is Said and the Candles Are Low. I'm no match for the godless knights. And if there are gods, I'm no match for them either. I build a fence badly, tear it down after dark. I used to love Wallace Stevens. I was young. Thus the dog bursts into my poem, follows me home. A mild wind follows the dog. Upriver, where a stand of birches leans, walking with a spent candle in my coat. I think, like so many poets, I find myself sometimes thinking of Lorca. And I think of Lorca particularly as summer comes to an end. Lorca, whose eyes are shot through with gold threads, whose eyes are numbers, whose tongue steers songs of harvest knives. There are many, too many to be sung. He can be wheat at the end of summer, can be a wheel, his pulse, the revolutions of a long, clear night of love. When September comes, he can be the first leaf in the fountain, perfect, death's butterfly. I recently, along with many others, lost a good friend, the poet Marvin Bell, who died this past winter. I was hoping to get this poem into his hands, but didn't. But this is dedicated to him. It's called Questions to Answers. I was guilty of reversing things so that water was sky when I rowed the boat early mornings. And I could see the purpose of trees was the perfection of earth. Boyhood was like swallows in June. I flew everywhere, upside down and fast. Oh, and I made solemn work of shadows, begging the darkness with my own darkness. a trick of the blind, always the smallest grains of feeling. This is why the gravity of seasons holds me awake. Almost foolish to say, I believe snowfall is the form and habit of gods, and they return against our will, and they talk of natural facts. They talk of natural facts. Whenever I want to cry, I think of boyhood and the gods, the virtual emptiness of a child's early mornings, blind in a boat. This comes from a photograph of a blind man selling pencils in New York City. And I guess in a way, like Langston Hughes, who I love, I got to thinking about all the curves and turns of history behind that man. To a blind man selling pencils, New York City. And then others arrived, eyes first, surveyors, important men, men who wore the flag, runners who filled the streets in every town. They carried sacks like thieves. Every day, such men feel their blood rise. It uses them, returns them to the avenues, and I alone discovered them, one by one. I was of the provinces. I was reflected in their eyes like a fire. Some men possess the color of origin. The blind man is amaranth, Aman word of sorts, a word that will be mistaken on earth. Still I saluted the closed world without its consent, crossed the water of streets, and raised a sign, unreadable as the moon. My plea had the whiteness of things that have no use in life, and the words were nothing more than a scar that someone must have given me. Why then did your name appear like the marks of a wheel in this unyielding light? This is the title poem of the book. The book is called Old Horse, What Is to Be Done? When I was young, which is to say, in one's late teens and early 20s, for reasons that are largely inexplicable, I got to know the poet Robert Bly rather well. And he was very kind to me, and he invited me to his home in Minnesota. And I got to spend time talking with him about poetry, surrealism, Neruda, Lorca, Thomas Transtromer, poetry and translation. I was very worried how I would live and what I would do having no real usable eyesight. And he told me that I should just go and live in solitude for a while and write poetry and not think about that. And I took his advice. I went off to Finland and lived alone in the far north and wrote poetry. So I bought an old horse, and I spent a lot of time with him. And as it is with animals, you feel a kinship. You feel the tenderness and joy of being alive. You feel the empathy of sharing a life, a space in life. And I guess the other thing to know about this poem is that I bring Heraclitus into it. Heraclitus, as you know, was the Greek philosopher who, of course, said famously, "We cannot enter the same river twice." He was called the Dark One, even by his own friends. because he meditated so strictly and intensely about the nature of mortality and the quality of time. And so I refer to him here as the dark one, the river compulsive. And he did, in fact, make clocks out of string. Old Horse, What Is to Be Done? For Robert Bly. I also want to live tonight, my pockets filled with ghost silver, the real coins I spent long ago. There are weeks, whole months when I read only the ancients. I mean the dark one, the river compulsive, a man who made clocks from string. Quote, time is a game played beautifully by children, end quote. Lately, this is all I can think of. When I was very small, I lived by a meadow. You loved me, and I wasn't confused. So that's the title poem. I'd like to read a little poem I wrote today. I lost a very good friend. He died in his sleep last night. We went to Iowa to the writer's workshop together long ago. He was my age. Things had not gone well for him in recent years. He became diabetic and a brittle diabetic. His wife was ill. He looked after her. And so he passed away too soon, and I wrote this today. It's called, as you would imagine, Elegy. I lost a good friend today, and it's snowing. What does it mean to write such things? My friend knew why we ask. He loved the life to come, though I only know dimly this body and the one tomorrow. Strange garment, wishing it will fit. Lord, our protector, may we by chance or grace feel the day after with heart as we depend on you, not in heaven, but here in April snow, no birds singing. So I'm going to open things up to questions. I think that would be lovely. And thanks for listening.
It was a lovely reading. And I guess what we'll do is while we're waiting for people to question, I've got a couple of observations and questions for you. And so while you're answering those, we'll wait for the questions to come in through the chat. Okay?
Sounds great.
Great. One of the things that you mentioned right away when you were beginning to talk about your poems was that you weren't going to spend too much time discussing what was behind them.
Yeah, and then I did it.
Oh, I think you only did that once. But one of the things I thought was wonderful was that it's great because what makes these poems so interesting is that there is so much behind them that can't be explained. It really is a one-of-a-kind book in that way. And before I ask any questions, I do think people need to know what one of your blurbists said on the back of the book, Suzanne Paola Antonetta.
Right.
Because she says it so well, I think people need to hear it. She says, no one moment conveys the beauty and austere brilliance of these poems. These are so finely wrought, they feel like precious coins in the hand, coins that have been unearthed as much as made. Horses, ravens, dogs haunt these poems, but so do Einstein, Kierkegaard, God, and many others. But above all, we follow Kuusisto, guide who is half soul, half body, These poems announce themselves as perfectly right and necessary, yet like nothing you've ever seen before. And I think that that's a pretty accurate description of them. They really are so wonderful and strange in the best possible way. One of the things I wanted to bring up was your sense of juxtaposition. And I noticed it everywhere, but one of the examples I'll give is on page 20, where you say in the poem, in a serial poem, Notes on Christmas Morning, you say, ice covered the pond like an illness. I was sad in my 20s. And just those two lines together, one would not normally think of them rubbing up against one another. And yet they do. And they make sense rubbing up against each other, but not an immediate kind of sense. It has to kind of sit with you for a while. And so there's a lot of, not only do these poems take up a lot of space horizontally on the page, like you said, you test the limits of prose sometimes, but they also seem to have a lot of space between the lines. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I wasn't joking when I said that, Robert Bly told me to go, and he told everybody this back in the day, right? You should go live by yourself in the woods, write poetry, don't have any friends, go far away. But I really took him quite literally, and I went off to the middle of nowhere and spent a lot of time in Finland in the dark. One of the things that has helped me as a writer, in later life is that I have been an inveterate keeper of journals since I was, 20. And I've, spent a lot of time translating poets. Many of the translations I never published, but I would have lines like illness, the pond icing over like an illness on a face. And I can find that, from 1980 or 79 or something, and realize, wow, I was lonely, and that this can just kind of fly into the poem as the poem is moving. And I feel very fortunate to have been sufficiently attentive to the inner life that I kept track of it, for a long time. And I can go back and tell you what I was doing on July 31st, 1980, Some years ago, I edited with the late poet Deborah Tall, who was a good friend, and her husband, David Weiss. I edited a book that's still in print from Norton called The Poet's Notebook. And we got, I forget how many, 30, 40 American poets, many of them very well known, to share with us their notebooks. Typically, that, of course, is something we discover when a poet has passed away, but they agreed. And so we got James Merrill and Anselm Hollow and Donald Justice and, beatnik people, and we got some very cool stuff. And it offers a rather great example of what I'm talking about, that, there be a little bit of translation, part of a recipe, things overheard on a trolley, and I've allowed that to become a kind of poetry form or anti-form, I guess.
So it would not be out of bounds to say that some of these poems, in a strict sense, took 40, 50 years to write.
That's true. That is true. And I should also say that I went to Finland on a Fulbright grant in 1982, and my goal was to really look closely at a new generation of Finnish poets who had emerged after World War II, and who were, really affected, as poets were in the United States post-war, by an increased awareness of global poetry. And so, just as we were warming up in the US to Neruda and Lorca and Juan Ramon Jimenez and, the poets of Scandinavia and South America, and we were becoming more mindful of global poetry. That was also happening in Scandinavia, and I became very interested in a Finnish poet named Pentti Saarikoski, who was really a remarkable figure. Some say he was the first truly postmodern poet. He did his graduate work at the University of Helsinki in ancient Greek and Latin, and that's how I got into Heraclitus. He translated the Greek anthology into Finnish, but he also translated the Iliad and Odyssey into Finnish. He translated James Joyce's Ulysses into Finnish. He translated The Catcher in the Rye into Finnish. He translated Saul Bellow into Finnish. He translated Finnish into, other languages. And so he was a really dynamic mover and shaker of language. But in his own poetry, what was so fascinating is that he could create poems in which you felt Heraclitus and what was going on right around the corner in the same space. And I spent a lot of time in Saarikoski's world, and I learned a lot from him. And this book felt like a place where a lot of the things I learned, in that lonely time, really finally found their place. There's a wonderful translation of Saarikoski's last 3 books called Trilogy, still available, still in print, and in English, American English translation by the late, great Anselm Hollo. And I highly recommend this book because it's unlike anything you've ever read. And your hair adheres to distant stars while you're reading it.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And again, we were talking before this particular webinar went live about the fact that this book, more than I believe, I'm fairly certain that there is no other book in contemporary American poetry that mentions or at least makes reference to Finland as much as yours does. So for those in the audience who may or may not know this, could you talk about your relationship to that nation and how that in some ways has influenced you as a poet?
Well, so first I should say that my earliest childhood memories come from Helsinki. My dad took us there when I was a very small child, and we lived there quite some time. And, Helsinki is a Baltic city. It's a rather magical place, especially for a small child. I think in a way it became my Dublin. It's a city of ancient paving stones and 3-masted schooners and, beautiful islands. They call it the Venice of the North because it's a city of islands that are connected. It's, a really rare and astonishing place. And Finnish literature is outside the Anglo, American or even main Romance language, European traditions. Finnish language is Finno-Ugrian. It's really its own language stem. And it has all kinds of qualities that I find very intriguing. On the one hand, it's a very ancient feeling in Finnish that you get, a kind of Vedic ancient quality in the language. At the same time, it's an incredibly prosperous and dynamic country filled with people who are, they invented the cell phone, for God's sake, so, it's a country full of very interesting people. It's also because it's a small country. If you spend enough time in Helsinki, you meet the leading opera singer, the leading playwright, you meet cellists, you meet all kinds of people and you have interesting conversation, right? I once said to someone that Helsinki is a little bit like having a kind of interesting globalized college campus all to yourself. So it's a special place to me. And I think in some respects, it's also a place with a kind of stoical toughness to it. You may know that the Finns are the only, sort of Eastern Edge European country to have beaten off Stalin, at the end of World War II. And the Finns are very proud of that. They're tough, they're pragmatic, they're persistent. There's a word in Finnish, sisu, S-I-S-U. It really can't be translated into English, but it means a kind of granitic toughness that the people, admire in themselves. So that's part of the attraction, I think.
Thank you. I've got other questions, but we do have one from Allison Myers. She says, Stephen, would you say it's essential for the generation of wonderful American poets coming up to familiarize themselves with poetry from other cultures and countries, albeit in translation?
I think that's absolutely essential. And I also think that poets should try translating, go buy a copy of, new poems from Paris and sit down. And even though you have only high school French, spend several hours with a dictionary translating. It takes you deep inside the fulcrum of language, the magnetic attraction and repulsion of words. It puts you in a place that is really rather remarkable. And it forces you out of the kind of self-generating shell of identity that we all tend to, live in. So that for a time you're someone else. And I think that's a damn good thing. I also think we're living in a time of tremendous global poetry, and with the web and the internet, we have great access to it. We used to have to wait months for the latest issue of New World Writing to come out and see what the poets in Ghana are doing, as Frank O'Hara says famously in one of his poems. But now you can just go and find out today what the poets in Ghana are doing. So yeah, I think it's really important.
Excellent. One of the things I wanted to ask you about while we're waiting for more questions is, or not even, it's more of an observation. You say something rather startling, but it's also very interesting in the poem 1919.
Oh, right.
Which is a prose poem. And you begin with, kind of a description. You say, now the children have climbed into the trees, though it's winter. Look at them. They are both preoccupied and disinterested. And then later you say, the poet hasn't shown the children. Accordingly, you only have propositions. And later then you say, the poet is filled with ideas, but stingy. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I love that. I love that proposition. The poet is filled with ideas, but stingy.
Well, first of all, to be truthful, if you spend enough time thinking about poets and poetry writing, and you've been in enough writing workshops, one of the things you learn is that it's good to withhold things, right? An awful lot of poetry goes on and on explaining itself or explaining what it's up to. And I love the fact that in this poem, I'm talking about kids who climb into the trees because there were rickets and starvation and influenza, and it's Scandinavia, and it was a bad time. But I'm not really interested in going too deeply into that, right? I'm interested in the fact that we can bring back the past and still not fully understand it and not really know it. But we can tip our caps to it. But we really can't explain those people fully, nor should we try. They have their own dignity, right?
And the image itself is worth exploring without the explanation of it, right?
Right.
Something. I just thought that was such a wonderful way to ironically be generous in a poem, is to acknowledge.
Thank you, because that's what I was aiming for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of generosity, you're very generous with other writers' words. Many of your poems are so wonderful, but partial portions of them seem like really well curated bits of other people's writing that you juxtapose together. I look at, for example, the poem on page 49, um, Notebook, Elegy for Pentti Sarakovsky.
Yeah. Yep.
Sarakovsky. And in several parts of that poem are just quotations from different sources.
Right. Right.
But you've expertly positioned them in a way that there's a kind of movement that wouldn't have been in those quotations independent of the poem. So I was wondering if you could talk about that kind of approach.
Yeah. Well, so when I was in college, we had a requirement. They did away with it after I graduated, but they had a requirement that in your sophomore year, you had to propose to the faculty, a team of faculty, a paper that you would write your junior year that had to be interdisciplinary in nature. So you had to come up with a topic that you would explore from different disciplinary perspectives.
Mhm.
And this was called the Baccalaureate Essay, and you had to write it your junior year. And if you didn't pass, you couldn't become a senior. So there was some pressure, you know. It was a tough demand. And I don't know how to explain this exactly, but I became very interested in Robert Bly's thinking about what he was calling at that time leaping poetry, right? That a poem could take you deep into the unconscious and then bring you back out again. And that one of the vehicles for that was, you know, the strange juxtapositions of images that you would get in surrealist poetry. And that, you know, the surrealism would put things together that didn't belong together, and that would shake you up and force you to, the only way you could feel or understand what was going on was through the subconscious, right? And I loved that idea. It's a great idea, especially when you're young and, you know, you're kind of getting interested in poetry for the first time, right? Bly says in one of his poems, "The poor, the dazed, and the idiots are with us. They live in the casket of the sun." And, you know, you can't draw the casket of the sun. You can't photograph it. It's a complete and perfect surrealist gesture that you either feel it and you get something shivery and complicated out of that, which was what Bly was after, right? And I became really interested in that. And so a professor that I liked said, well, if you really want to understand Bly, you should really go and read Carl Jung. So, you know, God help me, I went and began reading Carl Jung and his ideas about the universal unconscious and the fact that we could all fall asleep and have the same dream on the same night. And, you know, that there is a deep substrata underneath modern consciousness that is ancient and goes all the way back. And, you know, from that, I discovered Jackson Pollock. And though I could barely see, I really understood that Pollock was dancing with paint and was also working with the very same ideas, that you could bring forward images directly from the deep unconscious. And somebody asked Pollock, you know, what can you tell us about your painting process? And he said, and this sounds so simple, but it's really rather deep. He said, when I'm in my painting, I'm in my painting. And then I step back and see what I've been about. And if you really look at a Pollock painting, and I'm sure many of you have, they're gorgeous. They're lyric. They're astonishingly delicate. They have, you know, incredibly compelling balletic shapes and forms to them. You know, he really was working in a very deep way. And then Carl Jung took a photo of a Pollock painting and put it next to a micro photograph of a sugar crystal. And they're almost exactly alike, right? And Jung is saying at the core of the psyche is carbon and sugar. And here's Pollock, right, working in these trances. And I was totally captivated by all of that, right? And I still am.
So what you're essentially getting at is this urge to a kind of like put things together that don't normally come together, and that creates a kind of uh, in the poem, there's something that can't necessarily be explained, but viscerally felt.
That's exactly right. And there's a little bit of Dada surrealist collage making also to the process, right?
Interesting because Bly was one of those people who used that technique, but there was a lot of the poems were a lot more logically connected than we originally thought. And I think it's the same with your poems, is that even when the juxtapositions look rather startling or like I wasn't expecting to move there, there is a kind of relationship between the lines or between the leap.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I feel like you've inherited that really well from him.
I studied it hard, you know,
Yeah.
um, and spent a lot of years thinking about it. So
He's my favorite. He's among my favorite American poets, and that's probably why I love your book so much. Is that I feel that there's a kinship there in the book, in the poems, that you have a real sensibility that he shares.
yeah, well, we've forgotten Bly, and that's what happens. Poets disappear, you know, in America. But the truth is that I was just, you know, reading this new biography of James Wright, and you know, it brings back that in 1958, 59, Bly was just kicking American poetry into a higher gear by, you know, publishing his 50s and 60s magazines and really introducing to American poets for the first time Neruda,
Mhm.
Lorca, Jimenez, Cesar Vallejo, and, you know, and bringing forward poetry that um, wasn't this sort of confessional, uh, journalistic, you know, poetry uh, about what you had for breakfast and you know, walking along the seashore, and you know, there was a very literal quality to American poetry at the time. And he said, you know, poetry is stranger and richer than this. And he really caught a lot of people's attention with that. I think he's the most significant American poet, you know, uh, of the second half of the 20th century.
I would agree with you. I'm not sure many would, but
That's all right.
I
I don't care.
I would agree with you. And I remember there was this really great critic who's probably dead now, Martin Seymour Smith, and he said if more people looked to Bly than to Ashbery, that would be an encouraging sign. Now I love Ashbery, but I think that Bly is a terribly underrated poet or has not been treated well by posterity, at least now.
Well, and you know, all poets have certain you know, predilections that can get them in trouble.
Sure.
And for Bly, it was he so much did not want to work in a university. He hated, you know, although he got a degree from Iowa, he hated the academic creative writing biz. Uh, but the way that he managed to pay for this, you know, outsider status was really in certain respect to take advantage of the burgeoning 60s New Age movement. You know, the Esalen crowd and the, you know, the people wearing crystals and drinking kefir and, you know, making rope-soled shoes. And he, no, he really, he became a kind of avatar and guru to the New Age crowd about how to have a, you know, soulful, smart connection with the subconscious.
Yeah,
He
an
became,
authentic life kind of
and,
thing.
yeah, and he became a kind of lay preacher. And then he began to, you know, think about all the wounded men who were brutalized by their fathers, and he wanted them to get in touch with their inner lives. And you know, uh, some of that seems pretty goofy, right? It does. Um,
Or it's at least, at the very least, it's not on trend. It's not on trend right now.
yeah, yeah. But the poetry itself and the translations are stunning.
Yes.
And he's still the greatest translator of Neruda that we have.
And I we have a question, but I did want to say I also thought he was one of those poets who got better as he got older, and that's not the
Oh
case
man,
for. I
absolutely.
it's like most poets don't get better as they get older, and he got increasingly better as he went
Oh
into.
man, that poem, "The Night Abraham Called Out
Oh
to the
yes,
Stars,"
yeah,
you know, and
Those last three books are just unbelievable.
they're unbelievable. Yep. No, that's right.
But Allison is mentioning here something, a provocative question, which I think is interesting. And she says, Stephen and Tony, if every school were required to start their day listening to a great or challenging poem, would there be hope for the future of the planet? I'm going to leave you to wrestle with this one.
Oh, I think so. You know, great poetry is captivating. It's interesting. It's strange. It can be sweetly subversive in its own way. Um, it can speak directly into the hearts of kids, you know, and it would get the day off to a kind of depth psychology that, you know, most uh, most public education or private education just doesn't do. And so, you know, imagine starting the day with, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, or, you know, um, starting the day with Langston Hughes, wonderful writing on rivers, or a little bit of Walt Whitman, you know, um, what is the grass, child said, right? I mean, this is beautiful stuff. And so I
What was
agree.
that Muriel Rukeyser poem that if a woman told her story, it would the world would break open or something? I can't remember
Yeah.
what, but it was like if you hear something like that, your
Yeah.
consciousness expands, you know?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's right. And by the way, I love the R poets in America. So, you know, Rukeyser, Adrian Rich, and Rex Roth. I
Oh, well, the R's, we have some very good R's.
we do, we do.
And speaking of R, Kate Rushini says that she wanted you to, or at least mention Rumi, and maybe you want to talk a bit about that, or no? It just says here Rumi.
Well, Bly, you know, yet again, right? Not the great translator of Rumi, but he discovered Coleman Barks, and you know, and brought forward Rumi again to a wide American audience. And of course, those are the most wonderfully lyrical, intelligent, soulful, empathetic, strange, and potent spiritual poems the world has ever known.
Yeah.
And you know, thank God that that Bly opened the Rumi door. Um,
And Diane is correct. Diane, thank you for the correction because I knew I was getting the quote wrong. It's if a woman spoke the truth, the world would split open.
that's correct. Yeah,
And every time I even just read that or hear it, my body shakes.
it's absolutely an astonishing intelligence,
Yeah.
and you know, we're very, very lucky to have access to it.
Yeah.
I also think it's wonderful that toward the end of his, you know, Bly is still alive, but he has severe dementia.
Yeah.
But toward the end of his active intellectual life, he went to Iran with Coleman Barks.
Oh, for Rumi, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And those Coleman Barks translations are wonderful.
Oh God, yeah. You know, I mean,
So,
Coleman Barks.
we have time for other questions for Steve. Dan says we have time for one more question. I would love to have that come from the audience. And Allison's been great, but we've got 20 people in that audience. Let's hear from somebody. Anyone want to? I can ask questions all day long, but if someone else wants to, I don't want to. Where is the Q&A feed? Let me see here. Oh, here's an interesting one.
Good.
In a chaotic world, how are you a tender man?
That's a very nice question, and I appreciate it. You know, I want to say that I hail from a historically marginalized group, the disabled, and I've been denied, you know, a lot of access and inclusion in my lifetime. Even now, you know, I run into people who are just plain flat out mean. And I identify deeply with people of color and indigenous Americans and women and LGBTQ folk and Asian Americans. And, you know, I mean, I feel though, you can see me, I'm an American Finn with a big pink head. I identify with the outsider. And a very important book to me early on was Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. I was told in 1982 by professors at the University of Iowa that I couldn't finish a PhD because of my blindness. And that was, before the ADA. It was really not possible to sue. I've had my subsequent career comes from the fact that I have a terminal degree from the writer's workshop, but that was very wounding. And so I learned that you can burn your soul. You can flame it right out with rage and anger, and that I had to protect my soul and think of my soul as a candle in the wind, really, And so I do my own kind of homely, weird form of meditation, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody. But, I spend time thinking about grace and hope and gratitude and astonishment and love. Doesn't mean I'm not angry, but I try very hard to be forgiving. I don't talk about it much, but I am an Episcopalian, a kind of lefty, really a Bishop Tutu, kind of Episcopalian, the Gene Robinson gay-loving Episcopal Church, the Michael Curry branch of the church. So this gives me a sense of, sustaining power, not power in a kind of dominant way, but a sense of it'll be okay. You can alchemize this. So I try very hard to stay open and also really to forgive. If you can let go of, those who have wronged you, that's part of the genius of the Sermon on the Mount.
I know that was supposed to be the last question, but I don't want to miss out on Graham Harper asked a question and I overlooked it, and I'm sorry, Graham. It says here, it strikes me in your reference to Heraclitus that indeed much of your poetry is wonderfully about the unity of opposites.
That's true. I appreciate that, Graham. And hi. I think that's right. And I think that poetry at its best, right, makes a swing back and forth. Kabir says, between the conscious and the unconscious, a swing is set up and it never winds down. Poetry is all those polarities, right? Light and dark, sacred and profane, joy and sorrow. There's a wonderful poem by James Tate, the late, great James Tate, called It's Not So Much the Heat as the Humidity, is the title of the poem. And it starts with the line, only a dish of blueberries could pull me out of this lingering funk. And that's the opening line, for God's sake. And yet, isn't that right? We're down deep, we're in a kind of sorrow, and here's this dish of blueberries. And isn't that the way of it, right?
What a wonderful way. What a wonderful way to end. But I think it's one of the things is that you carry a lot of poetry around with you, so that you're able to just, in this conversation, you were able to bring that up. You were able you were able to excavate Tate from your memory and bring it and give it to us.
Well, and that may be a byproduct of not being able to see, right? I read and I retain things and I carry it around and I think about it. I also walk around talking to myself a lot. Maybe you all do too, but I'm parsing through this stuff and
as we wind up here, Dan did want us to have you read one more poem as we close. So I guess right now what will happen is you'll read this poetry, one more poem, and then this lovely time that we've spent together will come to an end.
Sounds good. Bear with me here a second. Here we go. This is a poem from my first book, which was called Only Bread, Only Light. This is about wandering around in New York. Only bread, only light. At times, the blind see light, and that moment is the Sistine ceiling. Grace among buildings. No one asks for it. No one asks. After all, this is solitude. Daylight's finger, Blake's angel, parting willow leaves. I should know better. Get with the business of walking the lovely, satisfied, indifferent weather. Bread baking on Arthur Avenue this first warm day of June. I stand on the corner for priceless seconds. Now everything to me falls shadow.
Thank you, Steve. That was beautiful.
And that's right to Graham's point. Well, thanks for having me, you all, and thanks for spending some time with me. This was lovely. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. That was really great and such a great conversation. Thank you to Tony. I want to thank Tiger Bark, and I want to thank everyone for coming. This reading and other readings will be online on our website in video form. You can watch it again.
Yay.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you and have a good night.
Have a great night, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care.